Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, we've heard how the candidates are faring this election season, but how's the media doing? I talk with a leading media ethicist next on Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. It's election time, and now more than ever, voters have multiple platforms from which to get their news about candidates and the issues. Blogs, Facebook, Twitter, streaming video, they're all part of both the political and media landscape now. And with these tools, citizens can get in on the action too, parsing, fact-checking, and sometimes making fun of what they hear. Traditional media are in some instances playing catch-up to this so-called fifth estate. So how is all of this changing the way we get our news and make sense of it? And what ethical challenges do these new media platforms pose? Here to talk with me about those and other issues is Kelly McBride. Ms. McBride is a media ethicist for the Poynter Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida, where she's worked since 2002. The institute trains reporters from around the country as well as studies the media. McBride is no stranger to Idaho, having started her career as a police reporter in North Idaho for the Spokesman Review newspaper. She's in Boise as the keynote speaker for the Oppenheimer Ethics Symposium. And welcome back to Idaho.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Such an important subject. Now, I mentioned at the top some of the many platforms for delivery of news that are out there, but that's just the beginning of the conversation, as we know. So I'm wondering, do you see all of this as good for the average person, the average citizen, for democracy, or is it becoming noise and static when we have so many outlets?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. It's good because there are a lot more voices that can be heard. Before the internet was accessible to everybody, a lot of people felt like their voices were not represented by the media. A lot of people of color, a lot of people with viewpoints that were outside of the mainstream political landscape didn't feel like they could have their opinions heard by large groups of people. Now everybody has a platform, and some people are really loud. There is a lot of noise out there, and one of the things that I'm looking at is how do we retrain citizens? You know, we used to have civics education in school, and it was basically how to participate in a democratic society, understanding how the government works. Some of that now we're going to have to refocus on how to sort through all that you have to sort through, because professional journalists don't do it for you anymore. We can't.
And having people understand that some of the blogs, for instance, that they're reading might be from a particular point of view. What I'm wondering is, do you see people just gravitating to the blogs, the TV channels, the Facebook pages that they agree with, so that we're getting kind of a hardening of views or a balkanization, as opposed to people broadening their understanding and knowledge of what's going on? It's just reinforcing what they already believe.
Yeah, so some people do that. Some people do that. Pew Research does a lot of investigation into this, and their latest research shows that about 30% of people prefer to receive information that reflects their own political viewpoint. And that's actually been consistent for decades. It's not a new phenomenon. Now, it's self-reported, so you could speculate that maybe it's a bit more, maybe some people don't want to admit it, but still, it's not everybody. It seems like everybody, but it's not everybody. Most people, when they go online and get information, go to somewhere between 5 and 7 sites. So they're getting some variety. Now, some of those people go to 5 to 7 sites that only reflect their own viewpoints. But most people, even if you're on Facebook, which is a self-selecting medium, you know, you choose your friends, but even if you're on Facebook, you're going to get some diversity of opinion. And so I think for the most part, people get more diversity of opinion, but they also can self-select. And so some people only see and hear what they want to see and hear.
And we'll get into fact-checking in a moment. But I want to ask you, the title of your speech that you're going to give is called Politicians versus the Press, a Social Media Cage Fight.
Yeah, yeah.
Worldwide
Worldwide wrestling. Yeah, you know, I wanted to make an allusion there. I wanted to be funny,
but what do you mean by that? Politicians versus the press, a social media cage fight?
Well, so it used to be that there was a pretty normal or normative agreement between politicians and the press, and it changed. It changed like at moments like when Gary Hart was busted on monkey business. You know, there are seminal moments when that agreement shifted, but it shifted slowly.
To not pry into certain parts of their life?
Not pry into. Politicians said, you know, you can come on the plane, you can come on the bus, we'll let you have access at certain times. It was a very civil kind of arrangement. Now, because everybody's the press, politicians are very, very wary. And because politicians don't need the press, they can go right to their audience, they have become very, very sophisticated at spinning their message. And the press is getting increasingly sophisticated at keeping up with that or staying ahead of that. And then you have the whole fifth estate, which are people who are sharing information. They're not necessarily the professional press, but they're still part of this game too. And so it really is a battle to control the narrative.
What about the opposite issue, not the press versus the politicians, but the two entities getting too close? I mean, maybe hearkening back to what you were talking about on the bus. For example, what about reporters that friend politicians on Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, you friend a lot of people on Facebook. That doesn't mean they're your real friend. You know, your Facebook friends are not your real friends, right?
Right. But you get to learn about maybe their personal life and.
Not really. I mean, most politicians have a very controlled Facebook presence.
Unless it's their personal one. I guess I'm talking about the personal one now.
Yeah, most politicians don't have a personal Facebook page. I mean, they are, so.
In Idaho, they do, though.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, they do.
Wow. I mean, most politicians are have somebody who actually manages their Facebook page for them, and they script it.
Still citizen legislature, so they still have personal Facebook pages.
Wow. So I think I don't worry as much as I used to about media getting too close to politicians. I think that was part of that old system where you maybe went out to lunch with them or were invited to their house for events or something like that. That actually doesn't happen as much anymore. Because it's a more antagonistic relationship, and because the media, the professional media, are in the spotlight as much as the politicians are, and so they get a lot of scrutiny these days. You know, there's a funny story out of Ohio where Connie Schultz, who was a columnist formerly of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, is married to Sherrod Brown, who's running for U.S. Senate. And somebody sent her an email that was investigating this very issue of politicians and media people becoming too close. And they said, we see several pictures of you, and you seem to be awfully close to him. And she replied back to this person. She said, well, I'm surprised you didn't see me kissing him so hard that he couldn't breathe. You know I'm married to him, right? So I think there's a lot of suspicion still that reporters are way too close to the press. It's actually much less so than it used to be.
Presumably she's not covering her husband, though.
No, not at all. She's a columnist.
Yeah. I want to ask you about one ethical issue just related to the election season, and that is all the money from television ads that goes to the stations. In Las Vegas, I just read an article that people there could potentially be seeing 10,000 ads a week. They have started to shorten some of the news shows, the news programs, to accommodate the ads. Some conflicts of interest going on there, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Because most television stations have a journalism function that's at least part of what they do, and at the core of that journalism function is telling the truth. Yet these stations are getting rich off of ads that distort the truth. And so there's an inherent cognitive dissonance there. And some stations, in Denver, there's a couple of stations that have actually started to fact-check the ads. So you might see this ad on their station, and then they'll come on in the news and say, actually, here are the things that are wrong with that. I think more and more local television stations are going to have to do that if they want to maintain any semblance of credibility. And man, if you're in a swing state, I mean, you wouldn't believe how bad it is in the swing states.
Well, that's what I'm saying, 10,000 ads a week in Vegas. Let's talk about the debates. Now, the conventional wisdom I hear all the time is, people aren't paying attention. It doesn't seem to make any difference in how they vote. but 70 million people watched the first presidential debate. I think 50 million the presidential debate. That first debate was second only in audience in terms of live programming to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, amazing
so people
amount
are
of
still
interest.
paying attention, and they're paying attention not only to the candidates, which we can talk about in a moment, but also to who's moderating too.
Right.
And Jim Lehrer, wonderful person, somebody we all admire
Great
here at
journalist,
public
great
television,
journalist.
did not do a great job in that first debate, and very quickly people started talking about that on social media. Now I know you and I spoke, and you thought that not only was it unfortunate for Jim Lehrer, but you looked at it almost as a defeat for what you might call old media.
Yeah, absolutely.
And why is that?
Well, I mean, I think Jim Lehrer comes out of that old school where there was, in fact, a gentleman's agreement between the politicians and the press that covered them. And I think he was too polite. And Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were operating with a different set of standards. They have been schooled in the new way of delivering information, which is you've got to elbow your way to the front of the stage in order to be heard. And so they ran right over him, and as a result, they were allowed way too much opportunity to spin the issues, and Lehrer wasn't very good at holding them accountable, especially compared to what they'd said before.
Now, we haven't seen the final debate that will happen after we're taping this, but we have seen the debates that were moderated by Martha Raddatz and Candy Crowley, and they got higher marks. They also, in my view, would be considered, quote, old or traditional media. So
well,
okay,
so both of them got to see Lehrer do a face plant in a debate and had time to prepare. So they had that benefit. In addition to that, I think that both of them were ready to assert the moderator's role. You know, I think that in the past, like, I can't even remember who moderated debates in the past. But
Jim Lehrer, a lot of them.
Yes, yeah. Well, and it just wasn't as important.
20 years since Carol Simpson moderated a town hall.
Yeah.
Since a woman had moderated a debate.
Yeah, that's horrific. I mean, I think the Presidential Debate Commission is also behind the times. I think they're, you know, we did at Poynter, we did an interview with the chairman of the commission and asked them, you know, what's up with all these old white people moderating debates. And they essentially said that broadcast news isn't producing anyone capable of moderating debates, which I thought is ridiculous.
And some young girls took offense to that, and if you go to the Poynter website, you can see Emma, one of them, who delivered petitions saying there should be a female moderator. She got her wish.
Yeah.
Now, most people, the Pew survey shows, were what Brian Stelter has from the New York Times has called leaning forward, leaning back, watching the debate in their couches, not leaning forward using social media. I think 8 in 10 were still watching the traditional way. Nevertheless, social media has a impact not only in promoting those debates happening, but then what happens afterwards.
Well, and I mean, actually, what happens during. So 1 or 2 out of every 10 people are using what we call a second screen.
Dual screen.
They're on their phone, or they're on their laptop, or their iPad, and they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook. Some of them are on YouTube, and some of them are in moderated chat rooms. But they're having a conversation as the debate is happening. I was doing this because it's the thing that all the young cool people do, and I wanted to see what it was all about. And I watched on my Twitter feed as soon as Mitt Romney said "binders full of women," it blew up. I mean, Twitter literally lit up with that phrase, and I started seeing it. You know, and I only follow a couple hundred people, but they were retweeting stuff, and so I put it in as a hashtag to see in a stream how many people were using it, and you couldn't even read the stream. It was scrolling by so fast.
Same with Big Bird when that happened.
Yep.
And what has resulted are these things called memes, which that gets my vote for the word of the year, meme. And those are kind of
funny
comical
visual jokes,
pictures that come out of the debates. These phrases, turns of phrases.
Right. So, I mean, you saw binders full of women, hundreds and hundreds of creative people with lots of time on their hands took that image and went forward. You know, they did the same thing with Clint Eastwood during the Republican National Convention, talking to a chair. My favorite of those memes, and it took until about midnight that night, was somebody made a Lego imitation of Clint Eastwood, and the term Eastwooding was coined. And it becomes a new way that we engage with the marketplace of ideas.
But is it, well, maybe this isn't fair to say, but is it fair in a way? Maybe what Mitt Romney meant was to say, got binders full of women's names, and he made a misstep. And so as a result, are people ignoring the main issues of a debate and focusing in on these other catchy things?
Well, I don't think that they're exclusively looking at the memes. I don't think anyone is just looking at the memes. In addition to that, the memes have deep meaning. I mean, one of the things that some of the people were saying is, first of all, the word binders. You know, one of the memes had Obama talking about iPads full of women, as opposed to, as if Obama's the technology guy and Mitt's the analog guy. Another one was talking about the idea. I mean, what they're trying to get at is the idea that it's not progressive to be surprised, to find it new and refreshing that you could actually come up with women's names who would be qualified to serve in your cabinet.
So there are underlying issues, and this helps the conversation. Although it probably is also people talking amongst themselves. See, making memes that support their point of view.
It's thought-provoking, and you got to realize that this is a generation that's grown up on South Park and Jon Stewart. So the younger generation, humor is huge. And if you look at the number of jokes that they make in the digital space, it's enormous compared to what we used to see through media when we were younger.
Well, speaking of jokes, let's get back to the reporters. I've noticed in some Twitter feeds, even of reporters, national reporters, joking, sometimes even sharing what I would say goes into their opinion of a certain person that they're covering. It's a different tone. We're used to having this kind of step back a little bit, more objectivity with the reporter neutrality.
Right, so there's a lot in there. Some of that you could say was just being plain old boring. I mean, if you were going to engage in social media, and any responsible journalist who wants to meet the audience where the audience is has to engage in social media, you have to show some personality. You have to show some life, and you want it to be authentic. But if you don't have any personality, you will not be effective on social media, and you have to be effective on social media if you're going to get your work in front of the audience.
That's what I was going to say. Do all reporters now have to be conversant?
I would say 95% of them need to be conversant. I suppose there's a few.
In social media.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's a couple of other trends at play here. One is that we're seeing the decline of neutrality as a position for delivering the news. Not completely. The traditional newspapers, television stations, they still, for the most part, value neutrality, and they do it for a marketplace advantage, right? Because advertisers want to get the largest market. But one of the things that we've seen with the rise of the fifth estate, these new bloggers and online startups, is that neutrality is an old school position. Most of them have a political point of view. They work from that political point of view, and the audience finds it refreshing.
And do you think it's okay as an ethicist?
Sure.
To have reporters expressing some of their point of view?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's worked in Europe for years, and democracy works in Europe. You can be, and in fact, some people in the audience think that it's important to know where you come from, because it's not like you don't have views, right? You just hide them from the audience, and that's what I do for the most part, because I still kind of want to get a job at the New York Times maybe someday, and I don't want them to not hire me.
Speaking of the New York Times, this is a traditional media that I think, now I'll share my opinion, it has jumped into the new media,
doing
social
media,
and doing a great job. I often stream the debates on the New York Times website, watch the analysis afterwards. Now you can go on their page, and they've basically chunked it up, so you can click on various parts of the speech, and it's fact-checked.
Right, and they started
there.
doing that in 2008.
Yeah.
So they've actually, they do a great job in the digital space, but you look at their young reporters, and they're out there on Facebook and on Twitter and showing a lot of personality. Now, they may not be showing their personal political bias, but they're certainly being very clever, telling a lot of jokes, and engaging with the audience in a spunky kind of a way.
But you have to be careful. The New York Times just laid off a freelancer for 4 weeks for comments he made on a Twitter feed.
Yeah, for being a jerk, though.
Right.
I mean,
so
not
you have
for
to be
revealing...
careful how far your jokes go, or the intern that wrote about the Asian American basketball player in negative stereotypical terms. So thinking it was a joke. So you have to be careful.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is if you're a jerk in real life, you're probably going to be a jerk on social media eventually. So if you're a jerk in real life and you're a journalist, then you maybe want to stay in that 5% that doesn't need to be on social media and find another way to make yourself valuable to your company.
And should all media entities, or if you're not part of a media entity anymore, you're a freelancer, have a social media policy?
Sure, you should have a set of guidelines, and those guidelines should talk about why you're in the social media space as much as what I hate guidelines that say don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, and instead I really like guidelines that say, hey, let's further our journalism. Let's get into this space because we can reach the audience and we can be more effective reporters and we can be more influential in the marketplace of ideas. So let's go there. And while we're there, let's pay attention to a couple of things. Here's our standards for revealing your bias. Here's our standards for how you reflect on the company. Because if you're in social media, and this is true even if you're not a journalist, people who know that you work at Company X assume that you are representing Company X when you say something on Facebook.
So you should not talk about politicians in a certain way. It reflects back on the company.
Yeah, if your company has a policy against that.
Now, I mentioned fact-checking. There's been a rise in fact-checking, including even apps you can get, like
right.
PolitiFact app, or you can go to factcheck.org. What do you think of this rise in fact-checking?
So two things. PolitiFact was founded in 2007, preparing for the 2008 election, and now fact-checking has become a separate discipline that many news organizations are latching onto, and it's much needed. It was always part of what professional journalists did, but to have a separate, distinct, neutral, like the fact-checkers have to be neutral, right? If the fact-checkers weren't neutral, then nobody would believe their fact-checking. So there's a realm of journalism that I think still needs to maintain a sense of neutrality. There's a lot more out there, and now they're moving into the mobile space, which is very cool. Like there's this app called the Super PAC app, and it works like Shazam. It's on your mobile phone. An ad is playing. You hit the button on the app, and it tells you who paid for the ad. How awesome is that? I mean, as a voter, I have a lot of information because it helps me judge the information that I'm getting in the ad if I know who paid for it.
Now, we don't have much time left. Unfortunately, television is one of these odd forms of media that's condensed. But with political blogs, there's so many out there. Are there a few that you'd like to mention that you think are doing a good job in the space? They all have their own kind of, the Drudge Report, let's just say, passed 1 billion page views a month, and if it were monetized, apparently would be worth several $100 million.
Yeah.
So this is business now.
Yeah, and the Drudge was one of the first ones out there, right? He was out there in the space, and he was like, hey, look what I can do. I can link to all these different things. He was an aggregator, and he linked to weird, sensational things. Wasn't particularly political initially, but then took on a conservative viewpoint because he realized that a lot of conservatives felt like their viewpoint wasn't reflected in the mainstream media, and so he started aggregating information for them. There are a lot of really good political, and blog is almost a bad word for it. I mean, I think of Politico, which is, I think, a left-leaning political online site, as pretty good. They do some good stuff. They've hired some pretty good reporters. ProPublica is an investigative site. They're pretty good. The Daily Kos, also left-leaning. I like the Daily Caller. It's a little sensational, but I find refreshing points of view there.
And you talk about citizens contributing. I know on certain blogs, Rachel Maddow's blog, people can send in what they see in their own community. So there's this kind of conversation going on as well, and ability to contribute into that as a citizen. Now, you have said, or have read on your bio, that what we're looking at is the transformation of journalism from a profession of a few to a civic obligation of many.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that we are all going to have to take some responsibility for journalism for a couple of reasons. The economic forces that pay professional journalists are continuing to dwindle, and we don't see a bottom to that. Most journalists are paid from some form of advertising revenue, and that just keeps going down and down and down, even as the economy recovers. The economy for journalists isn't recovering. Television is a different story because it's a political year, and so they have a political cycle. But print journalists in particular are going to continue to become fewer and further between. Online revenue not even coming close to replacing what we're losing in printed revenue. So we're going to have fewer professionals doing the work. So some of the work is going to come to citizens. A lot of professional news organizations have started to engage citizens by CNN has this thing where you take your iPhone to your voting place and you report what it's like. You know, is there a long line? What's the ballot look like? Do you understand what's going on? With all the issues about ballot boxes and whether they work and whether we're truly having enfranchised citizens, I think that's a great way to get way more eyes and ears out there than you ever could, even if you were at the staffing that you were at 5 years ago.
And as we wrap up, I know that you have gathered together a lot of the thought leaders of this so-called Fifth Estate, and you're going to continue to do that, and the result will be a book that you're going to be editing that's going to establish what you're calling a new democratic standard of truth in the digital age. Why is that? Why do you feel that's needed? What are you aiming for here?
Well, I think we're at a point in this revolution where things are actually stabilizing, and I think we can see what the best practices are. We can see how democracy can be served. We can also see how it can be undermined. And so what I'm aiming for is to create a set of standards that anybody who's interested in democracy would agree with and would say, yeah, you know, for my site, for my magazine, for my newspaper, for my television show, for my blog, for my Facebook page, I'm going to adopt these principles. And I don't pretend that I know what those principles are, which is why I'm turning to a lot of people who think and write and study this space. And we're all coming together in New York. Most of these people have written a draft of what they think are the most important issues, and we're gonna talk it out, and that will inform their ideas. And then next spring the book should come out, and hopefully it has. I mean, I hope that these will last. I hope that they'll last for 20 or 30 years. Poynter did this. Poynter did this in the 1980s. They came up with a set of guiding principles, and they've lasted this long. They just seem a little inadequate now.
Well, it's very exciting. Thanks so much for being here to talk about it. You've been listening to Kelly McBride. She is a media ethicist at the Poynter Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.